This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Stay tuned for an exclusive offer on how you can get 4 months free through Staged Right. One of the first YouTube videos I ever remember watching was Jennifer Holliday's performance of And I Am Telling You at the 1982 Tony Awards. While hearing her sing this song on the Dreamgirls cast album was one thing, watching her on the Tonys was another, and her legendary performance is consistently regarded as one of the best, if not the best, in Tony Awards history. Jennifer Hudson's performance of the song 25 years later in the film version of Dreamgirls would receive acclaim of its own, ultimately helping her win an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The movie also sparked controversy, partly from its deviations from the source material, but also by expressly aligning itself with the story of Motown and, more crucially, the story of the Supremes. Was there anything to this? How closely do these stories align? This episode will cover the creation of Dreamgirls, the creative genius of Michael Bennett, and the rousing, sometimes volatile period of time that produced a classic Broadway musical and a history-making performance with its leading lady. This episode is also going to consider the story of the Supremes and how they inform the story of Dreamgirls. Before we get started, if you're new to Staged Right and want to see more content like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'm very happy to share that today's video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. So when I'm not running the channel, I like to unwind after a long day by streaming a movie or a TV show from home. Now, as a Canadian, I am subject to what is available to stream in my country. But after connecting to Surfshark, I now have access to a whole other library of options from the comfort of my own living room. With a membership to Surfshark VPN, you can safely and privately link to servers around the world by connecting to a new IP, without any worry about malware or third parties collecting your personal information. Surfshark encrypts all of your data between the device and the internet, and its clean web feature blocks ads on all websites or apps that you visit. Whether I'm doing research for the channel or just want to watch a movie with my partner, this is a valuable and safe tool in expanding my viewing options online. Try Surfshark out yourself today. Enter the coupon code STAGEDRIGHT for an extra 4 months free at surfshark.deals/stagedright with a 30-day money-back guarantee. The idea for Dreamgirls first began with Tom Eyen, an actor turned writer-director who began his career off and off Broadway. In 1965, he gave a then unknown Bette Midler her first professional job, eventually starring in his production of Miss Nefertiti Regrets at Café La Mama. Part of the avant-garde theater scene downtown, he first collaborated with composer Henry Krieger in 1975 on the musical revue The Dirtiest Show in Town. Sometime after this show, Eyen and Krieger began talks about writing a musical that followed an all-black girl group and their dramatic rise to fame. Even then, the story bore a striking resemblance to that of the Supremes. In my researching for this video, I often found the story of the Supremes complicated, with many tangential considerations and varying accounts of how events occurred. For the sake of brevity and admittedly leaving much out, here is an extremely brief summary of the facts. While other girls came and went, the initial group consisted of Mary Wilson, Florence Ballard, and Diane Ross. While still just teenagers in Detroit, Michigan, the girls signed with a fledgling independent label called Motown Records in 1961, run by an ambitious executive named Berry Gordy. Success was not immediate for the Supremes. In fact, for a time, many at Hitsville, USA jokingly referred to the girls as the No-Hit Supremes. Things began to change, however, with songwriters Holland Dozier Holland, who created new arrangements for the group that had Diane singing lead. Her laid-back, coquettish vocals on Where Did Our Love Go would be the first of many hits that would help the Supremes find international success. Amidst a bevy of girl groups of the time, the Supremes distinguished themselves for their class, donning stylish gowns, elaborate wigs, performing demure choreography.
Very demure, very mindful.
While the girls had started out sharing the lead part, Diana Ross, as she was now known, would soon become the sole lead vocalist of the Supremes. The other girls would be disappointed in this change, perhaps no one more than Florence Ballard. Perceived to be pushed into the background by Diana, by then romantically involved with Berry Gordy, Flo began behaving erratically, drinking heavily, arriving to performances late or inebriated, finally being replaced by Cindy Birdsong and dropped by Motown altogether in 1967. With the events that followed in the ensuing years, and the implications on those involved in this Greek tragedy, it would be in the best interests of Tom Eyen and Henry Krieger to not follow the story of the Supremes too closely. The group devised for the musical, The Dreams, would be three girls from Chicago: Laurel, the good-natured stalwart of the group; Effie, the fiercely independent, soulful-voiced member of the group; and Dina, the charming, ambitious member with untapped potential. As the musical developed, it would nevertheless be difficult not to draw parallels to the iconic girl group. In 1980, Eyen and Krieger secured funding from Joseph Papp at the Public Theater to develop the musical, then being referred to as Project Number 9, with Tom Eyen writing and directing. For the part of Dina, he cast 23-year-old Cheryl Lee Ralph, then appearing in the ill-fated musical Ragay. After various pairings of women, he also cast Loretta Devine as Laurel, having most recently appeared on Broadway in the musical Comin' Up Town. To play the part of Effie, Tom Eyen had cast his friend, Nell Carter. She had first worked with Eyen and Krieger off-Broadway, and had recently won a Tony for her performance in the all-black revue Ain't Misbehavin'. But her time with Project Number 9 would be short, ultimately leaving to star in the TV sitcom Gimme a Break. Unwilling to go ahead without Nell Carter's involvement, Joseph Papp withdrew his funding for further development. From my research, there are varying accounts about how exactly it came to happen, but at some point, Michael Bennett was introduced to Project Number 9. Bennett at this time was considered a Broadway baby. Having worked his way up dancing in the chorus of several Broadway shows, he first made his mark as a choreographer on musicals like Promises, Promises, Company, and Follies. With his razor-sharp eye and theatrical flair, Michael Bennett gained a reputation as a fixer on Broadway, transforming the troubled musical Seesaw into a thrilling, if only modest, success. His defining success came just a few years later with A Chorus Line, of which he conceived, choreographed, and directed for the stage. Using over 24 hours of taped interviews, A Chorus Line tells the story of dancers auditioning for the chorus of a Broadway show. The bold and innovative stage production was a watershed moment in the American musical theater. Originally developed off-Broadway at the Public Theater under, who else, Joseph Papp, the show transferred uptown to Broadway in 1975, winning the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and every conceivable award you can think of. Michael Bennett would be thought of as the most influential director and choreographer of his time. A genius, totally indestructible. So it was naturally a shock to everyone when his 1978 follow-up to A Chorus Line, Ballroom, was a critical and financial failure, sending Michael Bennett into a deep depression. By all accounts, Bennett wasn't initially interested in being involved with Project Number 9, but after attending a presentation of the show's material, Bennett was compelled enough to fund a 6-week workshop of Project Number 9 at his studios at 890 Broadway.
Because I have a process which is called the workshop process, which is the way I did Chorus Line. And it's 4 6-week rehearsal periods, and you try out parts of the show. And you fix the show and shape a show around the performers, and without the pressure of being in a hotel room in Boston and a deadline and being in previews. And when you're satisfied with what's in the room, then you raise the $6 million and you go out and you do the musical.
For the first workshop, Michael Bennett would take a backseat, merely providing funding while continuing to allow Tom Eyen to direct as well as write. For the dance sequences, Bennett would hire choreographer Michael Peters. Like Bennett, Peters had started his career as a dancer, and in the ensuing years, he would become a key player in revolutionizing the music video, choreographing such works as Beat It and Thriller for Michael Jackson. With Nell Carter out of the picture, the team needed to find someone to play the part of Effie. Jamie Patterson, a cast member involved with Project Number 9, knew a girl from Houston, Texas performing in Broadway's Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with God, and thought she might be right for the part. Enter Jennifer Holliday. Not knowing who anyone on the other side of the table was, she auditioned and won the part of Effie, alongside her Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with God co-star Cleavon Derricks, who would end up playing the role of James Thunder Early. Just 19 years old, the creatives marveled at Jennifer Holliday's startling talent. A totally untrained singer, Michael Bennett's associate and close friend Bob Avian recalled that, She was so young, yet held so much pain and emotion in her face and voice that she lifted the piece to an entirely different level when she stood front and center. He also noted her stubbornness, constantly pushing against creative decisions in rehearsal. By the end of the first workshop, she would opt not to continue with project number 9. As well as creative frustration, she was also understandably exhausted. She said, "I was working at night, performing in Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with God on Broadway 8 times a week, and doing the workshop all day. I thought the material was corny, and that the workshop was going on too long." A common anecdote that's gotten a lot of mileage through the years perhaps needs some dispelling here. No, Krieger and Ian did not write And I Am Telling You to sway Jennifer Holliday back to the show. Actress Jennifer Lewis, who would later be hired after Holliday's departure, acknowledged the song was already in place by the time she joined the third workshop. Reflecting on her time with the show, she would admit many years later, "I just couldn't sing And I Am Telling You like Jennifer Holliday. Nobody in the world could. I always felt they hired me, the trained actress, to develop the character, knowing all along they were going to hire Jennifer Holliday back for that voice." At the end of the show's second workshop, then being referred to as Big Dreams, Michael Bennett offered to take over Tom Ian's role as director. While understandably disappointed, he would acquiesce to Bennett, knowing under his direction, the piece would find its greatest potential. Despite this, tension would persist between the two about the direction of the show. Michael Bennett, of course, had a unique perspective on show business, dating back to his career as a dancer, which at times put him in the same room as girl groups like the Supremes.
I knew the Supremes very well because I was a dancer on Hullabaloo and assistant choreographer, and they used to do the show every 2 weeks. Well, that was just another gig for them. They arrived with the plastic bags with the dresses in it, and their wig cases, and their makeup box. And there was no one from Motown there, and there was their driver and their chaperone. And I mean, that's why the Dreamgirls scenery, like all the dressing rooms, are just so simple. Because, I mean, they just moved from place to place.
Michael Peters, now co-choreographing with Bennett, would say, "Michael's genius was book. If A did not make sense to him, he could not go on to B. Michael took everything apart and reassembled the pieces. He knew it was not about the numbers, it was about making the book work, which he did." According to Michael Peters, at this point the show's numbers were strong, but there still wasn't a real story. Tom Ian didn't necessarily come into rehearsal with pages of a scene. Sometimes it would just be a concept, an idea of how to get from point A to point B. But there would be no words, and so he would get the actors to improvise scenes, come up with lines on the spot while Ian wrote them down. Speaking to George Colt of the New York Times, Loretta Devine recalled of the workshop period, "If you had an idea, they wanted to hear it." Colt continues, "One day, Miss Devine, responding to a sad moment in the emerging script, playfully chanted, 'Showbiz, it's just showbiz.' Michael Bennett perked up, and Dreamgirls had its recurring punchline." Corroborating Jennifer Lewis's suspicions, the Dreamgirls team did indeed have trouble shaking Jennifer Holliday from their minds. Michael Bennett would manage to bring her back for the fourth and final workshop that would culminate in a backers audition scheduled for April 1981. Holliday had been lured back on Bennett's assurance that the part of Effie would be equal to that of Dina. But almost immediately, Holliday regretted returning, noting that the part of Effie disappeared after Act 1, and that Act 2 was all about Dina. Jennifer Holliday told the New York Times, "I became upset and very depressed. I thought Michael had lied to me. He was telling me how great it was to be a star on Broadway, but I didn't see how I'd accomplish this being in a secondary role. Finally, I stopped trying. I did what I was told, but nothing else. I couldn't trust him. The first week in April, I told Michael that I'd do the backers audition, but not the show on Broadway." And as the story goes, Michael Bennett promptly fired Jennifer Holliday, and Jennifer Holliday quit Michael Bennett. Actress Elena Reed was quickly called in to learn the part. That makes 4 women in total who were part of developing the part of Effie White in workshop. Despite last-minute changes and frayed nerves, the backers audition would ultimately find Dreamgirls its producing team, Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs of the Schubert Organization, and record executive David Geffen, who would offer up $1 million of the show's $3.5 million capital. Plans began for a Broadway opening set for that holiday season. Likely under pressure from other members of the creative team, Michael Bennett would end up luring Jennifer Holliday back to the show. She had her conditions, namely, to have her part expanded, having input on her musical arrangements, as well as her costume design. One may be tempted to read these conditions as temperamental, diva-like. The press certainly did, absolutely frothing at the story about her falling out with Bennett during the workshop. I won't say the producers of Dreamgirls encouraged these news items, but they also didn't discourage them either. No, rather than viewing her conditions as being temperamental, I think it's important to consider that Jennifer Holliday went through Dreamgirls with no real designs or ambitions on Broadway. She started the project unfamiliar with Michael Bennett and his body of work, and therefore was not obliged to appeal herself or show deference towards him. Perhaps Jennifer Holliday simply wanted what she thought was fair. Sheryl Lee Ralph, playing Dina, may not have seen Jennifer Holliday's conditions exactly fair. Paired with Bennett's intenseness in rehearsal, her time with Dreamgirls was challenging in unexpected ways. In her memoir, Ralph writes, "It seemed to me that Michael thrived in an atmosphere of self-created tension. Drama and conflict were the order of the day. Michael did everything he possibly could to put a wedge between Jennifer and me, and wanted us to dislike each other. He would show blatant favoritism for me one day, and Jennifer the next. He would be hot and cold to both, often comparing us in front of the cast, and even worse, to each other. Since the Dina and Effie characters became rivals, both fighting for the limelight and, at one time, the same man, perhaps Michael felt the real tension would transfer well to the stage. Or maybe he just liked the drama. Either way, the atmosphere was thick with uneasiness while the show was still evolving. In a chapter of Michael Riedel's book, Razzle Dazzle, The Battle for Broadway, he describes a rehearsal for the final dressing room scene in Act 1, where apparently Sheryl Lee Ralph wasn't performing the scene the way Michael Bennett wanted. Riedel writes, he exploded, "Get the fuck out of rehearsals. Get out of the room. You have no fucking feelings. Get out of my life." After she burst into tears, Bennett took Ralph in his arms and said, "That's what I want, honey. And I want it every night." Stories like this are unfortunately unsurprising, knowing Bennett's history of manipulating tactics. There's often a Svengali Machiavellian analogy given to Michael Bennett, even from Jennifer Holliday. He, of course, had been key to harnessing her raw talent, and Sheryl Lee Ralph always gave Bennett credit for his genius, while also being the focus of some of his more mercurial outbursts. I don't think Bennett's motivations were ever intentionally malevolent. I think his goal was to make the show the best that it could possibly be, sometimes by any means necessary. For some, the outcome is what matters most. For others, the outcome comes at a cost. Under Michael Bennett's helm, the pace of Dreamgirls would accelerate, with swift cinematic transitions, barely giving the audience a moment to breathe. To realize the show's physical production, Michael Bennett would enlist his trusted designers from A Chorus Line, including Theron Musser as lighting designer. The show's set, while sparse, would be one of the first shows to feature automated scenery, with Robin Wagner designing 5 aluminum spotlight-studded towers, moving in various configurations to create the settings. And Theoni Aldridge's lavish costume designs would be a highlight of the production, with cast members performing inexplicably quick changes in a matter of seconds, sometimes right on stage. After a successful tryout in Boston, Dreamgirls began performances on Broadway on December 9, 1981, ahead of an opening night scheduled for December 20th. Initially, the show had been booked for the Winter Garden Theater. Instead, Dreamgirls would play the Imperial Theater on West 45th Street, and the Winter Garden would be held over till next season in order to house the new musical Cats. The show had recently opened in London's West End, becoming an unlikely but gargantuan commercial hit. As well as a unique configuration, the Winter Garden Theater on Broadway held a higher audience capacity than the Imperial, and based on the numbers coming out of London, the Shuberts were confident that they could fill it. This may represent a microcosm of how the Shuberts regarded Dreamgirls. It wasn't that they didn't have faith in Michael Bennett. They did. In fact, at one point, they had discussions about him re-choreographing Cats for New York. But even with the success of A Chorus Line, still selling out a mere block from the Imperial, Dreamgirls still seemed like an untried entity, with even those in the cast doubtful, of how a show led by 3 black women would be received by Broadway's predominantly white audiences and old guard of theater critics. While still trying out in Boston, Michael Bennett, Tom Eyen, and Jennifer Holliday were interviewed by theater critic Elliot Norton. The interview, which you can watch in part online, is notably stilted, perhaps telegraphing tensions of an out-of-town tryout, but I think also telegraphing how ill-equipped some from the theater community were in discussing the subject matter.
Well, you have background in this world of pop singers and soul music and so on. Have you been involved in that?
Well, I grew up in it.
Oh.
Because I come from the Midwest, and that's all you heard in the Midwest. Was the first radio station I ever heard was all R&B, which is strange.
R&B?
Rhythm and blues.
I never heard that one before.
Which is soul music.
Really?
Yeah, and that was the biggest thing in Ohio.
Michael Bennett reads charismatic and positive in a lot of the show's press leading up to Broadway, but there's no doubt that he had the failure of Ballroom in the back of his mind. Despite all the accolades and success, a chorus line hadn't made him invincible. Perhaps in 1981, Broadway was showing signs of change. Dreamgirls opened at a particular moment in the commercial theater, right at the advent of the British mega musical that would dominate Broadway in the next decade, and the waning popularity of the so-called concept musical, of which Michael Bennett, along with Bob Fosse, Stephen Sondheim, and Hal Prince, had used to create their most formative works. A little over a week before Dreamgirls began performances in New York, Sondheim and Prince's high-concept musical Merrily We Roll Along had closed after a brutal reception from audiences and critics alike. Even Frank Rich, the new chief critic of the New York Times and unabashed Sondheim champion, had called the show a shambles. Frank Rich's reviews would gain a reputation for making or breaking the success of a show. What would he make of Dreamgirls? At the star-studded Dreamgirls opening night party at Tavern on the Green, someone handed Michael Bennett an early edition of the New York Times. When Broadway history is being made, you can feel it. What you feel is a seismic emotional jolt that sends the audience as one right out of its wits. While such moments are uncommonly rare these days, I'm here to report that one popped up at the Imperial last night. Broadway history was made at the end of the first act of Michael Bennett's beautiful and heartbreaking new musical, Dreamgirls. Effie begs Curtis to let her stay in a song titled "And I Am Telling You I'm Not Going." As Miss Holliday physically tries to restrain her lover from leaving, her heart pours out in a dark and gutsy blues. Then, without pause, her voice rises into a strangled cry. Shortly after that, Curtis departs, and Miss Holliday just keeps riding wave after wave of painful music, clutching her stomach, kneeling over, insisting that the scoundrel who has dumped her is the best man I'll ever know. The song can only end when Michael Bennett matches the performer's brilliance with a masterstroke of his own, and it's a good thing that Act 1 of Dreamgirls ends soon thereafter. If the curtain didn't fall, the audience would probably cheer Jennifer Holliday until dawn. He called the moment the most powerful Act 1 ending of a musical since Ethel Merman's Everything's Coming Up Roses from Gypsy. Ironically, Jennifer Holliday was performing on the same stage that Ethel had closed Gypsy just 20 years before. Michael Bennett's confidence may have been firmly bolstered when Frank Rich alluded to Bennett's hero, the original director of Gypsy, Jerome Robbins. Mr. Bennett has long been Mr. Robbins' Broadway heir apparent, as he has demonstrated in 2 previous Gypsy-like backstage musicals, Follies, which he staged with Harold Prince, and A Chorus Line. But last night, the torch was passed, firmly, unquestionably, once and for all. I think Frank Rich, like most audiences in 1981, was absolutely smitten with Dreamgirls, dazzled by its design and relentless pace. Combined with its compelling story, infectious score, and soaring voices, Broadway audiences had never experienced a show like it. At the 1982 Tony Awards, the show garnered 13 nominations, ultimately winning 6. Ben Harney, Jennifer Holliday, and Cleavon Derricks took home trophies for their performances, with Tom Eyen winning for Best Book, and Michael Bennett and Michael Peters jointly winning for Best Choreography. When Milton Berle took to the stage to present the award for Best Director of a Musical, many understandably thought that Michael Bennett had it in the bag.
And the winner is... Dreamgirls, big mouth, Dreamgirls. And the winner is 9. Tommy Tune.
9, the musical, had only recently opened in the spring of 1982, and just in time for Tony Awards contention, quickly becoming a dark horse in the race.
Well, this is just great.
While never approaching the feral audience reaction of Dreamgirls, people coming to the show were taken with the stylish and sexy Fellini material. As well as Best Director, the musical also beat out Dreamgirls for Best Score from Orieston, and shocking many with Best Musical. Some tend to talk about this win in an underdog David and Goliath kind of way. Think Wicked and Avenue Q in 2004. But there may have been more politics involved in this outcome. Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs, the Schuberts, who were producing Dreamgirls, are thought to have been involved in a smear campaign against Nine. They were also caught up in the polarizing redevelopment of Times Square, being vocal proponents of demolishing a block of theaters to make way for a new hotel at Broadway and 46th Street. Anger and accumulating resentment for the Schuberts, perhaps even some goading from the Nine producers, may have tipped the votes away from Dreamgirls. For those interested in reading this story in fuller detail, I recommend reading Michael Rito's book, Razzle Dazzle, The Battle for Broadway. Despite the Tony upset, Dreamgirls would outrun Nine, playing for almost 4 years on Broadway. Looking at the initial reviews more closely, maybe not all critics were on board for Dreamgirls. Even Frank Rich conceded to a lack of clarity and rushed plot lines in Act 2. Douglas Watt, writing for the Daily News, said that Dreamgirls was all style and no substance. Walter Kerr, writing for the Sunday Times, noted that despite Michael Bennett's deft stagecraft, he found the production remote, firing on all cylinders without seemingly trusting the material. This is a sentiment I read a lot in conjunction with praise for Bennett's skillful production. Even members of the Dreamgirls workshop suspected Bennett of being uncomfortable with the material, and part of me wonders how much of that was about a white man overseeing an essentially black story. Many, of course, will note that Dreamgirls was conceived by few of the African-American experience. And for clarity, I don't think this is about Michael Bennett or any of the other creatives being unable to empathize with a black story, but in interviews about the show, Bennett sometimes reveals his own blind spots that may have prohibited him engaging with the material in a deeper way. He once said, "The problems that the black characters in Dreamgirls have are just problems about life as an American. The problems you have when you're in your 20s and you find out that happily ever after doesn't mean the things you thought, and that you can't get everything you want and it's not what you thought it was going to be. And if you're going to survive, you have to keep wanting other things." The important thing about Dreamgirls for me is that I approach the material as if cultural assimilation is something that has happened in America. Dreamgirls is not about being black, it's about being human. It's a black musical, but it's about people. It's not a black version of a white show. It's very nice for young blacks to go to the theater and see role models who are successful and still human. I think the crux of this meandering and absolutely insane statement is an attempt to say, I don't see color, I just see people. Writer Warren Hoffman, however, calls his bluff, saying of Bennett, "Such a statement doesn't hold, as the plot of Dreamgirls itself proves. A song by the Dreams is co-opted by a white musical group, Dave and the Sweethearts, becomes a hit, revealing the racial inequality that impacts the world of entertainment." By approaching this story with a historical revisionist slant, as if racial discrimination is not an issue, as if this was some Ryan Murphy fever dream, the musical basically turns a blind eye to the harsh realities black entertainers faced. While touring through certain parts of the United States, the Supremes, along with other performers of the Motown Revue of 1963, were regularly turned away from dining in at restaurants, using a roadside restroom, even hotel accommodations after a long travel day. Of course, Dreamgirls was not about Motown and the Supremes, though many would find it hard to deny similarities. This is Michael Bennett speaking with Terry Gross in 1986.
Everyone describes Dreamgirls as being patterned on the story of the Supremes. How literally is it really patterned on them?
Well, the Supremes were, of course, the most successful of the girl groups. There were many, many girl groups. There were many cast changes in those girl groups.
This feels, in part, like a deflection, but if you've seen the documentary 20 Feet from Stardom, there is undeniable truth in this. While drawing inspiration from girl groups of the time, Bob Avian mentions 3 films in his memoir that the creatives used to further inspire the story of Dreamgirls: the 1954 version of A Star is Born with Judy Garland, Love Me or Leave Me with Doris Day, and Sparkle. Curiously enough, this movie was also scrutinized for its own similarities to the Supremes story. In the original book of Dreamgirls, Tom Eyen seemingly makes efforts to distinguish the dreams from the Supremes. When the girls arrive at the Apollo at the top of the show, Laurel specifically mentions them, along with other girl groups like the Chiffons and Marvelettes. At the top of the second act, Dina, now the group's lead and a rising star in her own right, tells the press that she's looking to get into movies. Diana Ross was reportedly not happy with this reference, or Dreamgirls altogether. Rumored to have attended a performance in disguise, even receiving Sheryl Lee Ralph Isley during a chance encounter. Perhaps unrelated, Michael Bennett would eventually reconceive the opening of Act 2 for the show's LA premiere, reportedly dissatisfied with its original form. Eventually, those changes would be implemented to the Broadway production, and with those changes, out went the Diana Ross reference. Dreamgirls, of course, ultimately benefited from allusions to Diana Ross and the Supremes. Being so invested in the fashioning of her own image, it's understandable then to being frustrated at having that image extrapolated beyond her control. The show's allusions also called attention to the cloudy circumstances surrounding Florence Ballard's departure from the Supremes, which cast few, if any, involved in a redeeming light.
Florence was a wonderful girl, and Florence died at 32. But Florence fell in love with someone.
This is Florence Ballard you're talking about?
Yes, I'm talking about the real Supreme story. Florence fell in love with someone and wanted children and was not...
She wasn't pushed out?
She was not... No, she was... I don't believe she was pushed out. But she was not Diana. Talent-wise. In the show... Dreamgirls. Effie, it's about an R&B singer versus a pop singer. By the way, it's not about a fat girl versus a pretty girl. It was about a style of singing versus another style of singing. But it is not the story of the Supremes. Now, if it were the story of the Supremes, believe me, I would have been sued. You can bet on that, And it's not fair of me to tell the story of the Supremes. Now, after all these years, I've gotten so used to this, and I guess it doesn't hurt the show. And you see a lot of people that were not familiar with that particular period in time, of course, see the girls, and they go, well, this must be the story. Well, it's not. Diana will write a book, or Berry Gordy will write a book, or I hear Mary, by the way, has written a book that's coming out, and you'll hear the real story.
If Diana Ross was upset by the sympathetic light Dina Jones is cast in Dreamgirls, one can only imagine her reaction to the less than flattering light she is cast in Mary Wilson's 1986 memoir, all but confirming rumors surrounding Diana's reputation for diva-like behavior. Titled Dreamgirl, My Life as a Supreme, Mary Wilson also became the first member of the group to publicly comment on the musical.
This is some kind of story. They ought to make a musical about this.
Well, they did.
In fact, wasn't it Dreamgirls that gave you it was almost true, wasn't it?
It was, it was truer than most people thought.
Yeah.
Because the character Effie, who actually I say portrayed Florence's life, was so very right on. I sat there watching this play, and I said, my God, my life is on Broadway. Here I am, a little girl living in the projects, and grew up to see my life on Broadway. I was fascinated by that. But the play was not really about the Supremes.
That look is probably how a lot of people feel. And if the creatives of the stage musical wish to distance themselves from the Supremes connection, the 2006 film adaptation all but embraced it. After over 20 years of withholding the screen rights, David Geffen began discussions with Bill Condon about a Dreamgirls movie. An Oscar-winning writer who had penned the screenplay for the Oscar-winning Chicago, Condon would not only pen the script for Dreamgirls, but direct it as well. Now, when I asked my subscribers their thoughts on the movie, most who responded really loved it. And with this in mind, I think there is some great work to acknowledge here. The cast is impeccable, the cinematography often elevates the musical numbers, and there are some lovely nods to Michael Bennett and the original production that many will appreciate. There's even a music in the mirror moment from a chorus line, which, of course, Rob Marshall used in Chicago as well. Other moments, or allusions made, can sometimes read jarring or give one an ethical pause. The great efforts this movie makes in conjuring Motown and the Supremes often make it feel less like an adaptation of a beloved Broadway musical and more like an unauthorized movie about Motown and the Supremes. The examples are innumerable. But for instance, in the stage version, the Dreams are originally from Chicago. In the movie version, they are now from Detroit. Curtis is no longer just a manager, as in the show, but also a record producer of Rainbow Records, which at one point, like Motown Records, presses recordings of Martin Luther King's Cobo Hall speech in June of 1963. A relatively innocuous detail, but so specific to Berry Gordy, is Curtis now having sisters helping him run the company. Less innocuous is Curtis's involvement in payola schemes and doing business with the mafia. These details seem to corroborate long-held rumors of Motown's shady business dealings. Perhaps Bill Condon simply wanted to lay fun little Easter eggs for Motown fans. But where Michael Bennett lacked in contextualizing a black girl group's rise in the 1960s, Bill Condon's screenplay co-opts Motown's history to the point that certain moments in the movie feel exploitative, reckless, rather than meaningfully engaging in its actual history. On a positive note, I think one of the best things going for this movie is its cast. Eddie Murphy gives a career best as James Thunder Early, and Nika Nani Rose, fresh from her Tony win from Caroline or Change, is adorable and charming, holding her own amidst giants. And the absolutely cosmic casting of Jennifer Hudson as Effie, following her controversial departure from American Idol, is arguably the best thing about this movie. Fresh from her departure from Destiny's Child, Beyoncé is, in theory, an intuitive choice to play Dina. Though I personally sometimes feel her undeniable star power makes Dina's rise less of a revelation and more like an inevitability. After all,
she can't sing like I can. She's right, Curtis, I can't. I don't want to.
And
I'm amazed, Mr. Taylor. Much as I love my daughter, I never thought she had much of a voice.
But the problem is, she's played by Beyoncé, a superstar in her own right, and the audience at times has to negotiate with the filmmakers in believing Dina's shortcomings as a singer. And giving her due credit, Beyoncé clearly tried to address this while auditioning for the part. Watching her screen test, she intuitively dials everything back, rarely belting and keeping all the vocals in a mix or head voice. It's not bad, just smaller, contained, perfect for Dina. Something that, in my opinion, would have made her new song Listen at the end of the movie even more satisfying. But the powers that be ultimately settled for something that mirrored her own persona. I mean, not anywhere near this, but you get the idea. The film received mostly positive notices, with Eddie Murphy and Jennifer Hudson consistently being singled out for their performances. But even with its all-star cast, the movie didn't perform quite as well as some anticipated. Certainly compared to Chicago, which made more money at the box office against a lower budget than Dreamgirls had. The film garnered 8 Oscar nominations, the most of any movie in 2007, but failed to garner a Best Picture nod. David Carr of the New York Times speculated that as well as some missteps in the film's Oscar campaign, the movie was a tough sell to the Academy's predominantly white male membership. And it should come to no surprise that Bill Condon's many allusions to Motown's history, real or speculative, would inevitably piss people off. Paramount and DreamWorks Pictures would end up formally apologizing to Berry Gordy, writing in a statement, "Dreamgirls is a work of fiction. It is also an homage to Motown. For any confusion that has resulted from our fictional work, we apologize to Mr. Gordy and all of the incredible people who were part of that great legacy. It is vital that the public understand that the real-life Motown story has yet to be told." Controversy aside, the movie has become beloved by many, with elements being incorporated into a 2009 tour premiering at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. These changes, and others, would also find their way into the London premiere in 2016, a whole 35 years after the American premiere. The production, starring Amber Riley, was well received, winning her and Adam J. Bernard Oliviers for their performances. Plans for a Broadway transfer were rumored, but as of this video's publication have yet to materialize. Predictably, and possibly annoying to some, many critics could not help but compare Casey Nicholas' production to the original production by Michael Bennett. In fact, look up any review of the show from anywhere in the world, and the original production is usually referenced somewhere. While later generations of directors have no doubt been influenced by Bennett's work, no one apparent seems to have taken up the esteemed mantle, left in his absence. Michael Bennett died in 1987. One of countless in the Broadway community that would succumb to AIDS, along with Dreamgirls book writer Tom Ian in 1991 and co-choreographer Michael Peters in 1994. While promoting the Dreamgirls movie, director Bill Condon often cited the impact of the original production. It's interesting then to note the backlash the movie received from members of the original production. While lauding members of the film cast, Bob Avian said in his memoir, "In the end, I felt the movie captured the showbiz pizzazz without ever touching me emotionally." Others, particularly in the cast, had misgivings of the liberties that the film took with the story. Cleavon Derricks, who originated the part of Jimmy, took issue with the character becoming a drug addict in the movie, eventually succumbing to an overdose. Others, like Jennifer Holliday, voiced their disappointment of not being consulted on the film, even asked to appear for a cameo role. Jennifer Holliday also noted the studio using her recording of "And I Am Telling You" as part of the teaser trailer. Sheryl Lee Ralph, who was also not approached, says she was later told that her presence in the movie would have been a distraction. Hearing this makes Loretta Devine's appearance in the film all the more conspicuous, dare I say, distracting. You might just think, that's just showbiz, right? Dreamgirls is hardly the first movie musical to not feature original cast members. But there may have been something more personal in this exclusion. Oba Babatunde, who originated the role of Cece, reveals that he had actually been asked to audition for the part of Jimmy's manager, Marty, in the movie. He would end up passing on the audition, explaining, "I was one of the creators. That which I saw in the script that was sent to me was not in keeping with the piece I helped create." This echoes several members of the Dreamgirls workshop saying that scenes and dialogue emerged out of cast improvisations, and understandably felt somehow responsible for the material. Following the final workshop in 1981, cast members signed away their contributions for $1. Yes, $1. This arrangement, of course, however shoddy, had precedence. Those who had helped in developing a chorus line in the 1970s signed the same agreement. So while people like Michael Bennett became incredibly wealthy with the success of the show, many who had helped in creating their characters were left with nothing. In a New York Times article anticipating the 2006 Broadway revival of A Chorus Line, cast members like Wayne Cilento aired their grievances over the original agreement. He is quoted as saying, "At one point, when we were young and stupid, we kind of signed our lives away, and they exploited that. We were the authors of the show, and we should have been paid accordingly." Sheryl Lee Ralph once described the strange and surreal experience of watching Dreamgirls on screen, hearing Beyoncé speak words and dialogue that she had created. In a revised edition of her memoir, she recalls the original agreement, even citing Wayne Cilento's quote from the New York Times. She says, "We were very much a part of bringing these characters and their stories to life. We were young, dumb, and we were exploited. I believe to this day that we were in a way authors of the show, and should have been compensated properly." Since the Dreamgirls workshop, more equitable agreements have been made between producers and actors, while still leaving some to wonder how one's participation in a lab or workshop should be compensated through a show's profits. For Sheryl Lee Ralph, Dreamgirls had been one of the best and worst experiences of her life. Michael Bennett had been part of that, facilitating and encouraging her rivalry with Jennifer Holliday behind the scenes. It would take decades for the two to reconcile and publicly address the trauma imparted through Dreamgirls. It would be hard not to see the parallels between their reunion and that of Dina and Effie in Dreamgirls. While the characters in the show are given a chance of reconciliation, the real-life figures that inspired the musical would not be afforded the same opportunity. Much would be made about the estrangement between original Supreme members Mary Wilson and Diana Ross, with many fans lobbying for a reunion, professional or otherwise. Mary Wilson would speak often of her own personal hopes of reconciling with her old friend, hopes that notably grew skeptic in her later years. Seemingly, the closest they would get would be in 2013, posing together on the red carpet of the Broadway opening of Motown the Musical. This jukebox musical, by the way, was written and co-produced by Berry Gordy. While boasting one of the best song catalogs you'll find anywhere, those hoping to find illuminating insight on the story of the Supremes would be left disappointed. With Mary Wilson's passing in 2021, Diana Ross is, as of the publication of this video, the last living member of the original trio, and in the absence of Florence and Mary, the Story of Dreamgirls reads even more bittersweet. In the musical, Effie is given a second chance, unlike Florence Ballard, who at 32 died of a heart attack, broke and destitute. An ill-befitting end to a woman who, frankly, deserved better. At the end of Dreamgirls, Dina invites Effie on stage to sing with the group one last time. Old friends, a family, together once again. The musical gives us the happy ending, the ending that so many wished had come to pass. Dreamgirls is in essence a fantasy with vestiges of the truth. In the old tradition of the American musical, the story is given an optimistic viewpoint. Dreamgirls is about the pursuit of our dreams, the mercilessness of show business, and what really lies beneath the veneer of success. It's about compromise, betrayal, and the loss of innocence. And in the old tradition of the American musical, the show imbues the idea that with faith and perseverance, we may rewrite our story, to change direction, and make peace with the past in order to move on from it. In all its naivete, Dreamgirls aspires for the possibility of a happy ending. However complicated that path may be, it seems like one well worth taking. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope you'll leave here wanting to learn more about Dreamgirls, Motown, the Supremes, or the life of Florence Ballard. There are many books with many perspectives. These are some that you can look up, and please share your recommendations in the comments below. Once again, a big thank you to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Try Surfshark out today for an extra 4 months free at surfshark.deals/stagedright. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support Staged Right in a flexible, affordable way, please consider contributing via my Ko-fi or Patreon accounts. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.